Father Michael O'Connor had always been a trusted figure in the town. Tall, with a quiet strength and a soft smile, he exuded a calm that made him a natural confidant. His sermons were known for their warmth and wisdom, and he had a way of making people feel at peace, even during the hardest of times. People trusted him, and for good reason. Little did they know, behind that comforting presence lay a secret that would tear apart everything he held dear. Claire Foster had come to St. Andrew's Church seeking solace after the sudden death of her parents. She had been raised in a strict household where religion was central, but after losing her family, she felt an overwhelming emptiness. One rainy Sunday morning, she stepped into the church for the first time. The moment she heard Father O'Connor speak, she felt something stir inside her. A connection she hadn't known she was looking for. His voice, so gentle and sincere, seemed to reach right into her soul. Over the next few weeks, Claire became a regular at the church. She would linger after Mass, hoping for a chance to speak to Father O'Connor, to share her grief. She found comfort in their conversations, each one a little longer than the last. Father O'Connor, who was always patient and understanding, listened to her pain with a depth that made her feel understood, not just as a parishioner, but as a woman. Slowly, their bond grew, becoming more than just one of spiritual guidance. One evening, as the sun began to set, Claire stayed after a service, feeling the weight of loneliness pressing on her heart. She was the last person in the church, and Father O'Connor, noticing her sadness, asked if she would like to talk. They sat in the quiet of the empty church, and as Claire spoke about the pain of losing her parents, she found herself telling him things she'd never shared with anyone. About her childhood, about the loneliness she had felt in her marriage. Father O'Connor listened intently, his eyes soft but full of understanding. It was in that moment that something shifted. There was an electric tension in the air, something neither of them could ignore. In the weeks that followed, Claire and Father O'Connor began to meet in secret. Their conversations continued, but now they were more personal, more intimate. At first, they talked about everything and nothing, life, faith, loss. But soon their words became heavier, more charged. Claire found herself drawn to him in a way she had never felt before. Father O'Connor, too, began to feel an unsettling pull toward her. There was no denying the attraction, but neither of them fully acknowledged it. They both knew it was wrong, that a priest should never cross such boundaries, but the temptation grew, irresistible and undeniable. One night, when the church was locked and empty, Claire found herself standing at the altar with Father O'Connor, her heart racing. She had come there to seek comfort, but it was clear that something more had begun to unfold between them. A simple touch of the hand lingered a little too long, and then the kiss came. Gentle at first, as though testing the waters, but soon it deepened into something far more passionate. It was a forbidden moment that neither could have anticipated but could not resist. The affair had begun. What followed was a series of secret meetings in the dark corners of the town. Father O'Connor, once a man of deep faith, now found himself entangled in something far outside the boundaries of his calling. And Claire, despite her guilt, couldn't pull away. She was torn between her love for her husband Mark and the intoxicating connection she felt with the priest. But every stolen moment with Father O'Connor made her feel alive, wanted, and understood in a way she never had before. Neither of them was prepared for what would come next, nor for the consequences that would ultimately unravel their lives. As the months passed, the affair between Claire Foster and Father O'Connor intensified, becoming more complicated and dangerous with each passing day. What had started as an illicit escape soon morphed into a tangled web of emotions, guilt, and desire. Both of them knew they were walking a perilous line, but neither could summon the courage to stop. Father O'Connor, who had once been so sure of his vows, began to struggle with his faith. The guilt was crushing, but the pull he felt toward Claire was even stronger. He had always been a man of deep conviction, but now he found himself questioning everything he had once believed. Every time he looked at Claire, he saw a woman in pain, a woman who needed him, needed his comfort, his guidance. But soon, it became clear that Claire needed more than just guidance. She needed him in ways that went beyond the spiritual. He couldn't deny that he felt the same way. Their connection was more than just physical, it was emotional, intellectual, and it was taking over his life. For Claire, the affair had become a source of internal conflict. She loved her husband, Mark, or at least she thought she did. Mark was a good man, a devoted husband who worked hard to provide for her. Yet she couldn't help but feel a growing distance between them. He was often away on business trips, and the silence between them only seemed to widen the chasm. Claire had once believed she could be content with her life, but Father O'Connor awakened something in her, a sense of passion, of being truly seen and desired in a way her marriage had never quite allowed. But the guilt gnawed at her. She couldn't help but think of Mark, who had no idea that his wife was in the arms of another man, a man who was meant to be a beacon of virtue in their community. The affair became a dangerous game of balance. Claire started to feel as though she were living two lives. When Mark was home, she tried to act as if everything was normal, but the weight of the secret she carried was suffocating. She found herself growing more distant, more distracted, even as Mark noticed the subtle changes in her behavior. He would ask her what was wrong, but Claire would brush him off with vague excuses. She felt trapped, torn between her loyalty to her husband and the deep emotional pull she felt toward Father O'Connor. The priest, too, began to feel the tension mounting. Their meetings, once filled with stolen moments of passion and connection, began to feel dangerous. The small, secretive glances they exchanged during Mass, the quiet whispers after services. Every interaction was laced with a growing sense of dread. Father O'Connor had always prided himself on being a man of integrity, but now, as his feelings for Claire deepened, he found himself in a constant internal battle. He couldn't continue this way. He knew that it would only end in disaster, yet each time they met the temptation was too great. The pressure of keeping the affair a secret began to take its toll. Claire's anxiety grew with each passing day. She found herself staring at her phone, checking the time, constantly wondering if she could pull off another lie to cover for the time she spent with the priest. Mark grew more suspicious. He started to notice her phone, which she had once left lying around without thought, now hidden away at all times. Her moods fluctuated wildly. One minute she was happy and engaged, the next she was distant, lost in her own world. It wasn't just the growing distance between Claire and Mark that caused tension. It was the fact that both she and Father O'Connor knew they were playing with fire. They could not keep this secret forever. The thought of being exposed haunted them both. Father O'Connor, despite his growing feelings for Claire, tried to convince himself that he could still guide her spiritually, that their connection was not what it seemed, but deep down he knew the truth. The affair had become something far more complicated than just a moment of weakness. It was no longer just about comfort or emotional intimacy. It had become a dangerous obsession. The weight of the secrecy, the lies, and the guilt was closing in on them. The pressure was unbearable, and yet neither Claire nor Father O'Connor could bring themselves to stop. It was as though they were caught in a current that was pulling them deeper and deeper toward a point of no return. Neither of them could predict when or how it would all end, but both knew that whatever came next would change everything. Mark Foster had always trusted his wife. Their marriage, although not without its bumps, had been built on a foundation of love, loyalty, and mutual respect. He knew Claire's moods, the way she smiled when she was genuinely happy, and how she held herself when something was bothering her. For years, he had been away on business trips, and although their time apart was often necessary, Mark never thought it would lead to the unraveling of their relationship. But recently things had begun to feel different. Claire seemed distracted, distant, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was the small things that started to set his nerves on edge. Claire no longer left her phone out when she went to bed. She would quickly swipe it away or hide it if he entered the room unexpectedly. Her smiles didn't reach her eyes as they once did. She grew easily irritated over insignificant things, like when he asked where she'd been or why she seemed so tired. Mark, ever the patient man, tried to brush it off as the stress of everyday life. But deep down, something inside him whispered that it was more than that. One evening, after returning early from a trip, Mark decided to confront Claire about the distance that had grown between them. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her eyes glued to the screen. Mark's heart raced with the feeling that this moment would change everything. He stood in front of her, arms crossed, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on with you, Claire?" he asked. "You've been acting strange for weeks now. Is there something you're not telling me?" Claire froze for a moment, then slowly looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Mark knew then that whatever was going on, she wasn't going to make it easy for him to understand. Her lips pressed into a tight line and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed trapped inside. Mark's patience thinned. He stepped closer, determined to get to the heart of the matter. "Are you seeing someone else?" The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation and hurt. Claire flinched at the words. She had never expected him to ask outright, and in that moment the weight of her guilt seemed to crush her. She wanted to deny it, to lie and say everything was fine, but she knew she couldn't. The truth was there, unspoken, between them. She had been caught in a lie for so long that it felt impossible to escape. "Claire?" Mark repeated, his voice now trembling with emotion. "Are you having an affair?" For the first time in weeks, Claire felt the full weight of the truth. She was trapped. She couldn't keep pretending anymore. The guilt gnawed at her as she met his eyes, the look of raw pain on his face cutting her to the core. She wanted to tell him it was a mistake, that it was nothing, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she nodded, her face flushed with shame. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's with Father O'Connor." Mark stood frozen, staring at her in disbelief. His world, the one he had built with Claire, seemed to crumble in an instant. He couldn't fathom what she was saying. Father O'Connor, the man who had been a trusted friend, a spiritual guide, someone Mark had admired and respected, he was the one Claire had betrayed him with. It didn't make sense. The pain was overwhelming, a raw, visceral punch to his chest. His first instinct was to lash out, to scream, but instead he turned and walked out of the room, pacing the hall, his thoughts a blur. His hands clenched into fists, trembling with rage and confusion. How had this happened? How had he not seen the signs? He didn't know how long he stood there, but when he finally turned back to Claire, something inside him snapped. It wasn't just betrayal he felt, it was rage. Fury at the man who had not only stolen his wife's heart, but had also destroyed the trust Mark had placed in the church. He couldn't fathom how Father O'Connor could have done this, how he could have taken advantage of someone so vulnerable. Without a word, Mark left the house. His mind was a whirlpool of anger and hurt, and as he drove toward the church, he knew he had to confront the priest. He didn't know what he was going to say, but the need for answers, for some kind of closure, consumed him. The tension in Mark was unbearable as he stood outside the church, his hands trembling with fury. His heart pounded in his chest like a war drum, each beat urging him toward a confrontation he couldn't escape. For weeks, he had tried to deny the growing distance between him and Claire. He had tried to convince himself that it was just stress, just life getting in the way. But now, faced with the reality of her betrayal, he couldn't hold back the anger that consumed him. The priest, the man who had vowed to serve God, who had been a trusted figure in their community, was the one who had torn apart his world. Mark walked briskly toward the church doors, his footsteps echoing in the quiet night. The building loomed in front of him, its stone walls heavy with centuries of history. Inside, Father O'Connor was finishing his evening prayers, unaware of the storm approaching. Mark had always admired the priest, seen him as a role model, a figure of wisdom and virtue. But now, that admiration felt like a cruel joke. The door creaked as Mark pushed it open, stepping inside the dimly lit church. The silence enveloped him like a shroud. He walked down the aisle, the scent of old wood and candle wax filling the air. It should have been a place of peace, a sanctuary for those in need of solace, but tonight, it felt like a tomb. Mark's mind raced as he scanned the pews, his eyes darting around the quiet space, searching for the man who had shattered his life. Father O'Connor was standing at the altar, his back to the door. He was deep in prayer, his hands clasped in front of him. Mark's breath hitched as he took a step forward, his anger threatening to boil over. His mind was clouded with thoughts of the betrayal, the late-night meetings, the secret phone calls, the lies Claire had told him, and now the priest had to pay? He moved toward the altar, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. When Father O'Connor turned, startled by the sound of approaching footsteps, Mark didn't hesitate. His hand shot out, grabbing the priest by the collar of his vestments and slamming him against the stone wall. The shock on Father O'Connor's face was immediate, but before he could speak, Mark's fury erupted. "You took everything from me," Mark growled, his voice low and guttural. "Everything." Father O'Connor struggled in Mark's grip, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Mark, please." Mark's chest heaved with every breath, his pulse racing. The world seemed to slow around him, the priest's words muffled in his ears. Nothing mattered anymore. The betrayal, the lies, the pain, none of it could be undone. In that moment, the priest wasn't a man of God. He was an enemy, someone who had wronged him in the worst possible way. Mark pushed him harder, his anger flaring into a violent rage. He could hear his own voice, distant and strained, shouting things he didn't fully understand. It was like the world had been reduced to the heat of that moment, the rush of adrenaline, the pounding of his heart, the searing need for vengeance. He didn't know when the violence started, but suddenly he was choking the life out of the priest with his bare hands. The fingers that once had held Claire now wrapped around the man's throat, squeezing tighter and tighter with every passing second. Father O'Connor gasped, his hands clawing at Mark's wrists, but he was no match for the strength of Mark's rage. The priest's breath grew shallow, his struggles weaker, and soon the man who had once been a pillar of faith was nothing more than a crumpled figure, lifeless in Mark's grasp. Mark stood over him, panting, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. He looked down at the body, his mind still reeling. The rush of anger had left him, but in its wake there was nothing but numbness. The church, once a place of peace, now felt cold and empty. He stepped back, his hands trembling as he wiped them on his pants, trying to shake the image of what he had just done from his mind. The reality of the murder set in. He had just taken a life. He hadn't meant to, not really, but in that moment all he could think about was the pain he had felt, how it had shattered his heart and his sense of self. Father O'Connor had betrayed him in the worst way, and Mark had exacted his revenge. For a long moment, Mark stood there, frozen, as the weight of his actions sank in. The silence of the church pressed down on him, making his head swim. He knew he needed to leave, to get away before anyone found him there, before the town knew what he had done, but still he couldn't move. His body felt heavy, as if he were trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. Finally, Mark turned and walked away, leaving the lifeless body of Father O'Connor behind. The sound of his footsteps faded as he exited the church, his heart a twisted knot of confusion and regret. The world would never be the same. The morning light crept into the small town, casting a pale glow over the streets. It was a quiet Sunday, the kind of day when families would gather at St. Andrew's Church, where they had for generations. The air smelled of fresh bread from the local bakery and the faint scent of flowers from the gardens, but that morning something was off. A heaviness lingered, though no one knew it yet. The body of Father O'Connor was discovered by one of the church staff members just after dawn. He had arrived early, as he always did, to prepare the church for Sunday Mass. What he found was a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The priest, lifeless on the cold stone floor, his body twisted unnaturally, his eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. The immediate panic set in as the staff member rushed to the nearest phone to call the authorities. Within hours, the news spread like wildfire. The town was in shock. Father O'Connor was beloved by the community. His sermons had touched countless lives, and his presence at every significant event in the town made him a fixture in the lives of many. How could this happen? Who would want to harm him? The police quickly arrived at the scene, their first task being to secure the church and begin their investigation. As they examined the body, it was clear that this was not an accident. The priest had been strangled, the force of the attack leaving unmistakable marks on his neck. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry. This was personal. Mark Foster had left the church hours before the body was discovered, and his nerves were raw as he drove through the streets, trying to shake off the gnawing feeling in his gut. He had done something that couldn't be undone, something that would forever alter his life. He had murdered Father O'Connor, a man who had once been a friend, a guide, and a confidant. But in that moment, when the priest's hands had reached out for his forgiveness, Mark had not been able to stop his anger. His sense of betrayal had overridden any sense of reason. As the investigation unfolded, Mark's guilt began to eat away at him. He could hardly sleep, his mind consumed by the image of Father O'Connor's lifeless body, his own hands wrapped around the man's throat. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the death he had caused, and each time the weight of it crushed him further. But still he didn't know what to do. He couldn't go back and undo what had been done. It wasn't long before suspicion began to grow. The police had already discovered the security footage from the church, and although it wasn't clear enough to reveal Mark's face, it showed a figure matching his build entering the church late the previous evening. A few subtle details fell into place, including the fact that Mark had been absent from home. The authorities slowly but surely pieced together the puzzle. Claire, devastated and overwhelmed by guilt, finally reached her breaking point. She couldn't live with the lies anymore. The weight of what had happened, the affair, the death, was too much to bear. In a tearful confession to the police, she revealed the truth: the affair with Father O'Connor, the confrontation between Mark and the priest, and finally, the murder. She told them everything. Mark was arrested the following day. The town, which had once looked up to him as a devoted husband and upstanding citizen, was now faced with the crushing reality of his crime. The trial would be a spectacle, with the small community divided between those who believed Mark had acted out of a desperate, uncontrollable rage, and those who thought the priest's death was a necessary consequence of his betrayal. As the days passed, the shock wore off, replaced by a sense of disbelief and sorrow. The church, once a place of refuge and comfort, felt empty. Father O'Connor's absence left a void that no one could fill. St. Andrew's Church, the symbol of peace and unity for so many, had now become a symbol of broken trust and shattered lives. For Mark, the path forward was uncertain. He had lost everything: his wife, his freedom, and his own sense of self. And Claire, too, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. The affair, the murder, and the haunting consequences would forever mark both of them, no matter how much time passed. The town would never be the same again. The dark shadow of betrayal, violence, and loss had fallen over it, and it seemed there was no way to escape its grip. The town, still reeling from the events that had torn its fabric apart, slowly began to try and move forward, though it was clear that the shadow of what had happened would linger for years. Mark's prison sentence became a grim fixture in the lives of those who had followed the trial closely. 25 years to life felt like a lifetime of consequences for one fateful night. But for Mark, it was an endless reckoning. He spent his days in the quiet, oppressive solitude of a cell, his mind constantly replaying the moment when his hands had wrapped around Father O'Connor's throat, and the life had drained out of the priest's body. In prison, Mark had no escape from his own thoughts. His guilt, mixed with the sharp regret of losing everything he had once held dear, was a weight that he could never fully shake. His marriage was over. Claire, unable to cope with the devastation she had played a part in creating, left the town shortly after the trial. She couldn't bear the stares, the whispers, or the reminder of her own role in the tragic events. Her once strong bond with Mark had been shattered, and the affair with the priest, once fueled by passion and desperation, had left nothing but ashes behind. Life for Claire after Mark's conviction was an endless search for redemption and healing. She moved far away, hoping that distance would provide her the peace that seemed elusive in the town that had once been her home. But no matter where she went, the guilt followed her, a constant companion. She had betrayed her husband, and that betrayal had led to the death of a man who, though flawed, had been part of her life for far too long. The affair had taken everything from her, her marriage, her peace, and her sense of self. She sought therapy, took long walks, and tried to find ways to rebuild her life, but the emotional scars remained. The town, too, found it difficult to heal. St. Andrew's Church, which had once been a place of comfort and refuge for so many, now stood empty more often than not. The pews were filled with memories of the man who had been both a spiritual leader and, unbeknownst to most, a betrayer. The parishioners struggled with the dichotomy of their feelings. How could they mourn the loss of a man who had caused so much pain? As the years passed, the community began to rebuild, but the story of Father O'Connor, Claire, and Mark would never be forgotten. It remained a cautionary tale, one of betrayal, passion, and the terrifying consequences of letting unchecked emotions dictate one's actions. For Mark and Claire, the aftermath would follow them for the rest of their lives. Time, it seemed, could not heal the damage that had been done. It only allowed for a numbing acceptance of what had come before, a quiet resignation that some scars would never fade.